This is Utah, in the House Range. These are half-billion-year-old rocks, and you know what? They're full of animal fossils.
What is that?
I'm here to find them. For the first time in the history of life, animals were dominating the ancient seas, leaving skeletonized remains in rocks this age all over the world. That's right. This is the Cambrian, and we're right in the middle of a massive explosion of evolution. But these rocks don't just contain ordinary animal fossils. A few feet out of this entire sequence will contain fossilized soft parts of the rarest animals ever seen. If the Burgess Shale had never been discovered, the world would know these rocks. This is the Wheeler Shale. I'm David Smith, and I'm on a journey to learn about Earth's deep history. To understand our place in this incredible saga. It's an ancient story, and it's written on the rocks. It's a story that spans 4 billion years, and there are remarkable clues to tell us how the world once looked. As a geologist, I can use those clues and take myself back in time. And being out here on the rocks, you can transport yourself to any part of Earth history to see and touch those long extinct forms of life. It's time travel, and this time I'm going back 500 million years, back to the origin of all modern animals, back to the Cambrian radiation. And I'm hoping to find some incredible fossils. Life on Earth has always been dominated by life in the oceans. It's where we got our start. It's where there's always been the greatest diversity. Reefs have always played a crucial part in growing that diversity. They are the cities of the ocean, with all the vibrancy and activity of a modern metropolis. There's no reason to think, and the rocks certainly do not deny, that reefs have always been this way. But reefs have not always been as we know them today. Coral reefs only began appearing in the rock record 20 or 30 million years ago, even though those modern corals had evolved 220 million years ago. But before coral reefs, there were bryozoan reefs, archaeocyathid reefs, and even before the animals, there were still huge, grand reef systems being built by stromatolites and algae. The limestone reef that caps these shales below represents one of these huge ancient Cambrian reefs. A reef made of algae this big, and we find them rimming the shores of the ancient continent Laurentia, just like the Great Barrier Reef. If we can imagine this huge limestone sequence representing the reef, and these shales representing the deep water deposits below. And what this is telling us is there's a sequence of events going on here. See, limestone is precipitated out of seawater. It's not deposited in fine grains the way the shales are. So the limestone has to be deposited in a warm, shallow sea. But the shale has to be deposited in very deep water. We know this because it's finely laminated. We know that it must be deposited so deep that even the largest storm wave does not rip up those layers. So we're looking at two completely different environments. And what this is telling us is there's a sequence of events, a gradual increase in sea level so that we have a deeper and deeper environment at the same location. Then we begin to deposit the shales. And then when those sea levels drop, we can imagine these huge limestones advancing over the shales.
You'd think the place to look for the greatest diversity of life would be in the reef, but soft body parts and reefs made of algae rapidly decompose or are eaten before they can be preserved. In fact, rarely do we ever see soft body parts in the fossil record. So how do we get them? Just over 100 years after the birth of Charles Darwin, an American geologist named Charles was about to discover a new chapter in the story of life on Earth. Charles Walcott was already one of the country's most important scientists. He had been the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, helped found the Carnegie Institute, and in late August of 1909 was secretary of the Smithsonian collecting trilobites in the mountains of British Columbia. He was searching through similar age shales, deposited deep below an ancient limestone reef, when he would find some of the strangest animals he had ever seen. Carbonized fossils of soft parts, uniquely preserved due to a special mix of deep water anoxia, capturing a snapshot of evolution. These were the fauna of the Burgess Shale. Not just the skeletons, but fine leaf-like appendages were clearly preserved, in many cases capturing aspects of the animal not seen in any other fossil rock. Even guts and other soft parts that would normally decompose in a matter of hours were somehow lithified, maybe moments after death. But Walcott never recognized the full context of his discovery. It was only later in the 60s and the 70s that paleontologists would rediscover his collection and realize that many of these animals defy typical classification and may represent extinct phyla, unique to the Cambrian. It shows us the Cambrian is a time when animals were evolving at the highest taxonomic level. Experiments in body design, where high rates of diversification and extinction would end with virtually all major kinds of animals we see for the rest of Earth history. Without fossils like the Burgess Shale, we would have missed a record of this crucial time in the history of life. This kind of diversity of life wasn't living in the deep ocean. These animals were living in the reef. Oxygen levels in the Cambrian were still so low, we think the deep oceans occasionally would have been hostile to complex life. It's why we don't see any burrows in the shales that preserve soft parts. These animals were being washed into deeper waters, and the lack of oxygen in the mud is what helped preserve them.
Anoxia is necessary to preserve the soft body parts, but it needs much more than that. Even in an anoxic environment, sulfur-reducing bacteria can begin to break down the soft body parts within hours, and all of those things like guts and intestines are lost. So you need something more.
There are special minerals being formed right at the time of death that you can only form in this unique kind of ocean chemistry. And not all of these rocks formed under those conditions.
Most of these quarries are dug out for the specific purpose of finding the sites with the best trilobites. Locals around here and fossil collectors don't really know much about these soft-bodied Burgess Shale fossils. So wherever you see the quarries are being knocked out of the rock, it's not a scientific excavation. Most of the quarries that you see have been dug out by locals, professional fossil collectors, and some people that have placed mining claims on this land. Now, trilobites can be sold, some of them for as much as thousands of dollars, but they're not by any means rare. Even rare ones are easy to find if you're going into the right places. And part of the reason for this is trilobites molt their exterior shell the way a crab does, and in this period it drops off parts of its body, and often that's what's preserved, not the entire body itself. So you'll see a trilobite head, a centerpiece of its carapace, or the tail. Occasionally you do see a whole trilobite, and this can tell you a little bit more about how they lived. This trilobite here even has its eyes preserved. The trilobite eye was an incredible thing. The trilobite eye was made out of calcite, This is a unique feature to most animals. Most animals produce their eye out of some kind of soft material. It's much easier to form into a lens and get the kind of image that you want to have perfectly clear without any chromatic aberration. This is a pure calcite crystal. And it has an interesting optical property called birefringence. When light is passed through a crystal of calcite, it splits that light beam into two different beams. Now, let me see if you can see this. But now, there are actually two dots, and as I rotate the calcite crystal, the dots also rotate. This would be a tremendously disadvantageous effect for a trilobite. It managed to overcome this. This light beam is actually polarized in two planes. And if you get the orientation of the calcite just right, you will only see one image. So the trilobites had managed to get their polarization planes perfectly so that they would not have this aberration effect. But a lot more than primitive crystal eyes were evolving in the Cambrian. Life was still experimenting with how to even construct an animal. But to find these rarest fossils, it's going to take a bit more work. We're gonna take a walk. That's the middle wheeler. Above this is a carbonate platform sequence. It's a series of carbonate reefs. You can see them. Up at the top is a really interesting one. You can see the more pinkish reddish formation at the very top of the ridge, and just below that a slightly grayer carbonate. And you can see the contact between the top carbonate and the slightly grayer carbonate is uneven. It's jagged. And then as you get over here, there's almost a steep slope down to a deeper portion. That's not a fault. That is actually a feature of the Cambrian seabed. Alright, so we're going to hike up to the top of the ridge in front of me. Shale unit right there, that's the Wheeler Shale. There's also some more shale outcrops in the Pearson Cove. This is the reef that's above the shale. There's also another one as the shale strikes through the valley. There's another outcrop over there. And I looked at that one last night. There are certainly some trilobites in there. Apparently here there is a small mineralogical difference between the shales that do and do not contain the soft-bodied fossils. The ones that do have a slightly higher clay content, and the ones that don't are almost entirely made of limestone mud. But if you look at these rocks, you can't tell the difference. Here's another site here. Oh, look at this. Here's one just falling right out of the rock. Let's see if we can clean it up a little bit without destroying it. A lot of these rocks have dendrites in them. Don't be fooled by these. These are not fossils. These are crystals that form, like snowflakes along the bedding plains, when fluids rich in iron and manganese flow through the rock. Not the clay-rich rocks we're looking for. Clay minerals have a slightly higher content of potassium, thorium, and uranium, then those elements are radioactive. And if you can pick up this minute difference in radioactivity, you can detect where these clay-rich rocks are. And that's what people have done. The rocks can tell us something else about this time in Earth history. where these shallow water carbonates are moving into deeper waters as those waters become shallower and shallower. But there's something even more interesting going on between the shales and the carbonates. You can see that these are carbonate rocks interbedded with the shales very finely.
This gray limestone was deposited as fine-grained mud, washed in from Laurentia in storms or river currents. The rhythmic banding is controlled by the intensity or location of these storms. It's hard to date these rocks at that timescale, but it's likely this is climate changing.
Okay, so we've got company. I've got a convoy of 3 jeeps that just crossed into my valley. They can't see me, I can't see them from where I am. I'm walking along one of the upper reef contacts. They should reach my campsite in just a few moments. We'll see what happens. Hopefully they don't take my rocks. Hopefully I lock the car. If I didn't lock the car, I could be totally screwed. I did not expect people after all that. They're here for one thing, I think. It's the only thing you do in this valley. Alright, I think they're passing my camp. Moving on. We've got 1, 2. They're looking. What are they looking for? Get down. Moving on. We got 1 going back. You can see some people that came in on their very fancy dirt bikes, but they've decided to not walk more than 3 feet to get to some pretty crappy stuff. I finally made it to the shale which is inside the Pearson's Cove. This is obviously a good place to be because it takes a lot of effort to get here, and whoever got here before has excavated quite a lot of shale. You know, it's the place when you're just walking around and you see fossils just peeking out on the flat slabs. They've been pulling it out of very narrow seams, and you definitely had to put some effort to get up here. Let's find some rocks. There's so much in these rocks, you have to be kind of careful and go layer by layer. Look, right there, we've got some fossils in that layer. I don't want to break them, and there's probably a lot more between that and them, so I'm just pulling these apart layer by layer with this paint scraper. I was working away on this slab, pulling out some fossils, and then of course I run into this one. Of course, I've got this impossible layer to get out from right above it. And that's going to be difficult. Oh, and it looks like there's still one more very thin layer. And of course, it's just a head, so we went through all that work and it's not an entire body. But we did manage to get it out. So I've been working this layer and I came across some more fossils. Of course, I think I found what we're looking for. I won't even venture to guess what this is. You can see that there's a lot of structure in there, and I think even the gut you can make out of whatever this is. A lot of the soft-bodied features in these rocks are very obscure, but I think
These are finally what we're looking for. That is not very convincing, but there's more than one. As I was looking at that, I came across another one. So there seems to be a small family of them in this layer, and here's a small trilobite right there too. So this is definitely it. So I'm almost there. You can see I've got most of it uncovered. I've consulted my book of Burgess Shale fossils, and I'm still not sure what the hell this is. It's a strange one. There we go. There's much more of it. There it is. Here's the other side. What is that? I may have just had a glimpse of life in the Cambrian seas. Just like Walcott, I don't know what I've found exactly. Many of these creatures are coiled in the mud and caught between bedding planes. It could be one of the many early experiments in making an animal. Incredibly, after the Cambrian we see almost no new animal phyla. Most were evolved right here, in the few million years spanning this little sliver of shale. It's one of life's great mysteries still being solved. And all the stories, so many secrets to life on Earth. They're out there,